Tonight, it's a pleasure, as always, to welcome back one of our favorite speakers, Professor Chris Lowe. He's going to discuss white shark nurseries in the Northeast Pacific Ocean. Dr. Lowe is a professor of marine biology and director of the Shark Lab at Cal State Long Beach, where he teaches courses also in marine biology and ecology. He has a bachelor's degree in marine science from Barrington College, Rhode Island. That's where it used to be. And then a master's degree from Cal State Long Beach and his PhD from the University of Hawaii. He's clearly not only one of the state's and the nation's leading experts on sharks of all kinds, but one of the world's experts, and he frequently is seen on television and in newspapers. He grew up on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts, and a lot of members of his family in previous generations had been fishermen. He decided after growing up swimming and fishing that he would go over to the dark side and get an education. So it's really, I think, we've all benefited from the things that he has done in not only working on sharks and rays, but working to establish what the ecological value is of offshore oil rigs. He's been a pioneer in tagging sharks and so that we can understand where they go, what their life cycle is, and so on. So it's a real pleasure to welcome back Chris Lowe.
It's always a pleasure to be here. It's always fun to come back to Long Beach Aquarium and give talks. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on for 10 years with my students, and it's kind of changed my perspective about ecology and conservation in particular. So it's really easy to get a little discouraged these days about the environment because we hear bad news all the time. And of course, being a shark biologist, we tell people all the time sharks are in trouble, we got to do more to protect them. But what if I were to tell you sharks could come back, populations could come back? And I didn't really think about that until I started working on this project. So the bottom line is our knowledge of white sharks has changed dramatically over the last 20, 25 years. In fact, 25 years ago, if you asked any shark biologist what kind of shark we thought a white shark was, we would say, well, they're a coastal shark. And you said, well, how do you know that? We'd say, well, in the fall months, it's not uncommon to see these sharks along these areas up off Central California coast, up here off the Año Nuevo, Farallon Islands, around these offshore islands like Guadalupe. And the reason why they're there is these critters right here. So they're coming in to take advantage of these nice, big, fat northern elephant seal pups. So those animals are drawing them in during the fall months, and biologists and researchers and even the public would see these large white sharks along the California coast. But the other thing that we learned was that white sharks obviously have been using California for a long time, and we know that based on historic fishing records. In fact, most of what we knew in the early days about white sharks didn't just come from observation, they came from historic fishing records. So white sharks have been reported caught in a variety of different fisheries in California and Mexico, all the way up to Oregon, even Alaska. So when we combed through some of those fishing records, my students and I found some really interesting trends. So one of the things we found, and this is broken out by different types of fisheries, is that the fishery that was shown to have the greatest degree of interaction with white sharks was what we call the entanglenet fishery. And the entanglenet fishery is a gillnet fishery. That's a net that fishers put in the water that fish swim into and they get caught around the gills. That's why they're called gill nets. They're a very, very effective method of fishing. And when we looked at the number of sharks reported caught in this fishery, you see that over 88% of all white sharks caught in any fishery were caught in this one fishery, which, by the way, didn't really start in earnest in California until the 70s. So we see that a majority of the sharks caught are very small. These are what we call young of the year, yoys. So young of the year is a shark that's less than 1 year old. It's usually less than about 6 feet long. And you'll see that a bulk of what was being caught in this fishery were these juveniles and these young of the year. But the other fisheries really didn't have very much impact. And the reason for that is most of these other commercial fishing types either a hard time surrounding an adult white shark, or adult white shark could break right through the gear. So they rarely would catch them. But we did see that white sharks were being caught in recreational fisheries as well. But by far, gillnet fishing was having the greatest degree of impact on white shark population. So when we looked at those fishing records and we looked at where those sharks were being reported caught, so these squares that you see are what are called the Department of Fish and Wildlife fishing blocks. So a commercial fisher, when they go fishing in a location, don't have to give the exact location where they caught things. They have to tell what block they caught them in. So if we look at the number of adults caught, you'll see that, first of all, very few adults were ever reported caught in fisheries in California. But when they were caught typically around the offshore islands like Anacapa, off Catalina, and Palos Verdes. But when we look at juveniles, so these are sharks probably between about 6 feet long and about 10 feet long, we see that they start popping up in these coastal blocks. So one of the things you'll notice is that this area off Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, Huntington Beach, and Dana Point seem to be the main hot spots for juveniles. But it's when we see the babies, the young of the year, that's when we see this really coastal pattern. So up off Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, Huntington Beach. So the problem is these are fisheries data. So fishers are fishing in places where they're going to catch the most fish, and quite often these places are also closely associated with major ports. So obviously we can't tell whether the fishers are catching these sharks because that's where they're fishing the most, or whether these are the places where these sharks want to be. But nonetheless, they tell us something about the distribution of sharks before we had all this wonderful technology. So the other thing that's really interesting about white sharks, and we still don't have a lot of good data on them, but one of the things we do know is that their life history is very much like people. So for example, they take a long time to reach sexual maturity. They live to be anywhere from 45 to 70 years old. Females may only produce a litter of pups every 3 years, and the litter sizes range anywhere from 2 to maybe 10 pups. So in many ways, they're very much like people in terms of their life history, which makes them very easy to overfish. In addition, they've always been of value, even though there's never been a directed or targeted fishery for white sharks. Anytime they're caught, their meat is of value. Their jaws, a set of adult white shark jaws can sell for over $16,000. Fins sell for over $200 a pound, and you can get almost 80 dried pounds of fin off an adult white shark. So anytime they've been caught, they've historically been worth money. But white sharks have never occurred in high enough abundance in any location for it ever to be a sustainable fishery for them. However, they have been caught incidentally in many fisheries, as I just showed, particularly the gillnet fishery. And of course, when they have been caught, historically, they were landed, and their meat was sold, and their jaws were sold, and the teeth, and so on. The thing that I find most impressive is that despite the fact that occasionally they'll nibble on people, we had the wherewithal to put in place protection for white sharks in California in 1994. And this is really impressive because this is coming at a time when we didn't really know a lot about white sharks, but we did understand enough about their vulnerability to understand the need to protect them and their role in the ecosystem. They were protected throughout the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico since 1997. In 2004, they were protected under CITES, which means their parts, their teeth, their jaws, their fins, their meat could not be traded internationally or sold internationally. And they were protected throughout the rest of US waters since 2005. So pretty much every place where white sharks occur in abundance, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they have been protected for over 25 years in many of these locations. So one of the interesting things was when we look at that gillnet fishery, remember that's the fishery that had the greatest impact on white sharks, accounted for 88% of all the records. When we look at that fishery over time, we see some really interesting patterns. Now the circles you see are the offshore drift gillnet fishery, which was targeting swordfish and shark. And then we had an inshore drift and set gillnet fishery, which was targeting halibut, angel sharks, and white sea bass. Now this gillnet fishery would literally set from the shoreline out offshore to intercept those animals as they make their movements. So you'll notice that these two fisheries both start in the late 70s, early 80s. They peak in the mid 80s, and then we see that the number of nets being set start to decline. So in the peak in 1985, there were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 nets being set per year. That's a lot of fishing going on, and much of this in coastal waters. But one of the interesting things happens in 1994. Number one, white sharks are protected. So if a fisherman caught them, they literally had to let them go. But prior to that, any white sharks caught, like you see here, actually were landed. They were brought back, they were sold in fish markets, and chances are if you ate shark back in the late 80s to early 90s, you ate white shark and you didn't know it because the meat looks just like mako shark or thresher. You can't really tell the difference. But another thing happened in 1994, which was really interesting, was the state banned the use of gillnets in state waters. They made it illegal to set gillnets from the shoreline out to 3 miles. And the reason for that was because there was high bycatch of marine mammals, birds, and particularly these target species were declining. So since then, this is the amount of gill net fishing effort that occurs. So remember, gill nets still are legal, but they have to set outside 3 miles. Gill net effort has been reduced 82% since its peak. But look at the number of sharks being reported caught in the fishery. So we know that this fishery probably was underestimating the number of sharks reported caught, because back in this time period, fishers, when they had to report what they were landing, didn't even have to say what species of shark it was. They just landed it as shark. So we know that this probably underrepresents how many white sharks were caught in that fishery. But the important part is, look at this trend. So gill net fishing effort has not increased, but look at the number of sharks being reported caught in the remaining fishery. So when we see that trend, as a biologist, you look at something like that and you go, okay, that's a lot of young sharks being caught in this fishery. This looks like a sign of increased recruitment, which could be an indication that the population is going up. So the other thing that was happening about the same time, remember I mentioned, back in the old days, we thought white sharks were coastal sharks. At the same time, I had colleagues at Stanford University and other researchers off Mexico that were tagging white sharks with a technology called satellite telemetry. And by putting these satellite tags on these sharks at these feeding aggregation sites in the fall, literally overnight, our idea of what kind of shark a white shark was changed. It went from being a coastal shark to actually being an oceanic shark. These sharks actually spend 8 months to a year and a half out in the middle of the Pacific before returning back to one of these feeding aggregation sites. So we talk about them being coastal sharks, but they're really only in coastal waters during the fall months. And the rest of the time, they're out in the middle of the Pacific, and we have no idea what they're actually doing out there. The other reason why white sharks come back to shore, especially in the spring, starting around May, is to give birth to their young. So one of the things we found in the fishing records is starting in May, it is not uncommon for recreational fishers to catch baby white sharks off coastal beaches and piers. In fact, we found records dating back to the late 1800s of recreational fishers catching baby white sharks in Santa Monica Bay. So what's really interesting about this is, based on this, you would hypothesize that the Southern California Bight, that area from Santa Barbara down to mid-Baja, is probably a nursery for white sharks in the Northeast Pacific. So our front yard is their nursery. So starting in 2006, we began to work with Monterey Bay Aquarium, who wanted to try to keep a white shark on exhibit. And the aquarium has a very strict ethic about what they try to keep. It's really important for them to understand the needs of the animal in order to know whether they would have an exhibit that could adequately take care of them. So we started working with many of the commercial fishers that were accidentally catching these white sharks so that we could help the aquarium address the habitat needs of those sharks. In other words, what are their favorite temperatures? How deep do they go? How far do they travel? What do they eat? So in order to keep animals, they had to be able to answer those questions. So to do this, we started working with the commercial fishers who we knew were catching these sharks based on the fishing data that we were collecting. So the gill net fishermen that were fishing off Southern California became our research partners in this project. So we had several questions we wanted to try to answer. Number one, can a shark caught in a gill net, brought back to the dock, poked and prodded by us, taken out and released, can that shark survive? That's question number one. Question number two, if they do survive, where do they go? Are they in the places where gill net fishing is occurring the most? Are they moving all around? Where are they spending their time? We also want to know the degree of interaction. How often do they interact with the fishery? And here you can see a baby white shark being held by a commercial fisherman. This is one of their fish totes that they bring their fish back in. We also wanted to know, how far do sharks migrate? Do they stay in Southern California their entire time, just move offshore, or do they migrate to different places? Here's a baby white shark in a fish tote with legal-sized California halibut. And do they show, if they do migrate, do they show kind of natal homing? Do they come back to their birthplace, or the place where they first started hanging out along our beaches? So these fishermen, if they caught a shark, would call us up. My students and I would meet them at the dock. We could assess the shark. We could take a blood sample. We could take a series of measurements. We could take a tissue sample for genetic analysis. And then we could instrument these sharks with a variety of different types of electronic tags to try to answer those questions. So we use 3 types of technology. One type of tag that we used are called satellite tags. These are called spot tags. These get bolted to the shark's dorsal fin, and it's a radio tag. So every time the shark's dorsal fin breaks a surface, this transmits to the satellites, and then the satellites then send us a signal back, or it sends me an email back in my office saying shark number 205 just popped up, and it gives me a latitude and longitude. So it gives me an actual location. Now, because this is radio waves, and radio waves do not penetrate through seawater, as soon as the shark goes underwater, the transmitter stops transmitting. Now remember, these are not marine mammals. They do not have to come to the surface to breathe. So we weren't sure we were going to get that much data using this technology, so we wanted to give ourselves some insurance. So we used other types of transmitters called pop-off archiving satellite tags. Now these transmitters have a depth sensor, a pressure sensor, and a light sensor. Attached to a little computer, these get darted into the shark's back, and it's measuring those parameters while the shark's swimming through the water, and then at a pre-described time and date, this thing is designed to pop off, float to the surface, and download all the data to the satellite, which then sends me an email with all the information. So the cool thing about these particular tags is we can program in, if the shark remains at the same depth, exact same depth, for 4 continuous days, it's assumed that the shark has died and sank to the bottom. The tag then assumes the shark is dead, it releases, and it pops up to the surface. So it helps tell us whether a shark has died or not. So by using these 2 forms of technology, we can track sharks over very large distances. The problem is they don't give us a really accurate estimate of where the shark is when it's not at the surface. So that's where we use this other technology called acoustic telemetry. So acoustic telemetry, instead of using radio waves, we're using sound. And we're transmitting sound through the water. So the transmitters that we either surgically implant into these sharks or put onto their backs have a unique ID code. And when these sharks get within about 500 yards of one of our underwater acoustic receivers, the receiver logs the time, the date, and the ID number as the shark swims by. So think of this like Easy Pass, you know, how you get for the toll roads and you're driving down the toll road and then you get a bill at the end of the month saying, oh, I drove down the toll road 3 days this week, right? This is just like that, except for sharks. So we have these receivers all along the coastline, and when those sharks get in about 500 yards of one of the receivers, it logs that information. So now we can get information on long-range migration, as well as how much time they spend along our beaches. So here's some data of the fishermen that we work with. These are the locations where fishers caught sharks. This line that you see, that's the state demarcation line, and gillnet fishing is not allowed inside that area. Now, the redder the squares indicate the greater the amount of gillnet fishing that's occurred in those locations between 2006 and 2009. So when you look at this pattern, the first thing you go is, ooh, that's not good. All the symbols are in the reddest areas. But remember, they caught these sharks that we tagged. So obviously, that's where they're being caught, where the fishers are fishing. But the other thing that's really interesting is note in 2006 to 2009, a vast majority of the sharks that we tagged were off Ventura, but only 2 sharks were tagged in Santa Monica Bay. Now, what if we use that technology where we bolt on that spot tag onto the shark's fin, and every time the shark pops up, it gives me a really accurate latitude and longitude? What if we use that to tell us where the sharks are when they're not being caught in the nets? So the next figure I'm going to show you are what we call our spot tag data. So these are locations where the sharks were at the surface and we got a really accurate position. All the white dots you see are detections inside state waters where gillnet fishing cannot occur. 44% of all the detections were very close to the shore. So there's no gillnet fishing occurring there. The black symbols are where gillnet fishing can occur. So one of the things you're going to notice is that first of all, not all the dots are in the reddest squares, which means there is some fishery interaction. Fishers are catching the sharks. That's how we caught them to tag them to begin with. But they're not spending all their time in the places where fishers are fishing the most. The other really interesting thing to point out is that, remember all the sharks were tagged up here off Ventura? They spent all their time in Santa Monica Bay, in a place where there's a lot less commercial fishing. So one of the things that we were starting to note, remember our gillnet fishermen caught them there. Remember I told you our gillnet data suggested that there are these hotspot locations along the coast. Well, the sharks' movement data are telling us that those areas may not just be a fishing artifact. In other words, sharks are using these hotspot areas. One of the other things we noticed by working with the commercial fishers was that some years they would have a lot of dead sharks in their nets, and other years not so many. And what was really interesting was if they had a live shark in their net and they called us up, we met them at the dock and we put those tags on the sharks and we would let the sharks go, we found out using those pop-off satellite tags, 94% of those sharks survived. If they were found alive in a net, 94% survived. However, we asked the fishermen, what's going on when you're finding sharks dead in the net? And what we found was sometimes when they're out looking for fish and they weren't finding fish and they were checking their nets and there was nothing, they would get frustrated and they'd start leaving their nets out a little longer. In fact, they left them out 2 days. When they left their nets out a second day, there was a much higher likelihood of a shark being found dead in the net. So this information was really important. Remember, the fishers are working with us. They're our partners in this research. And the two things that they learn from working with us is if you check your nets quite often, we know these sharks will survive. So all you have to do is check your nets more frequently. So one of the other things that we learned was if we had to wait for fishers to catch sharks, we would be waiting a long time to get data. So we decided to try to do this on our own. And of course, when we first started this, what we would do is hire a commercial purse seiner, the ones that get bait. We'd hire a spotter plane. They would spot the shark. We'd set the net around the shark. We could purse the net up, and we could take the shark out of the net and basically work the shark up the same way we would if we got it from a commercial fisherman. Great technique, two problems. $5,000 per shark, got a little expensive. And the other part was, at the same time we're trying to do this, our permits would not allow us to use this method within 900 feet of a beach. However, our new partners, which are the lifeguards, are telling us, hey, guess what? These sharks are literally just outside the wave break. And we would know, the spotters would say, oh, the sharks are 200 yards inside of where you can fish. So we had to come up with a new method of tagging. So this is where we work with our new partners, which are the lifeguards. And we've been working with lifeguards all throughout Southern California. So the way we do this now is by working with our lifeguard partners. I put my graduate students on the back of a tow board on a jet ski. And then we have either a spotter plane or a drone pilot tell them where the sharks are. And then you're going to see a little video here. My students will drive up alongside the shark. And when they get close, the student rolls into the water. We can dart a tag into the shark's back. And then we're good. So we put in a little transmitter, it goes in the shark's back. It's just like an earring. That transmitter will stay in the shark for about 2 years. And using this method, we were able to tag about 6 sharks in an hour. In addition, quite often when my students were done tagging, they would stand up and they'd be in waist-deep water. So that's how shallow, that's how close they are to the beach. So I'm going to show you some data that's really kind of interesting pattern that we noticed from many of the sharks that we tagged. So this is going to be from the pop-off archiving satellite tag data, which doesn't really give us a really accurate position. So what you're going to see is a black cloud up here, that little black cloud. Here's going to be a date counter. And then you're going to see sea surface temperature map will change on a daily basis. So here you'll be able to see would be this black smudge would start to move down as the water began to cool. It would come all the way down here starting in about October. So it spends all its first summer here. And it would start coming all the way down to here to this area called Vizcaíno Bay. And around January, that black smudge would kind of stop. And it would kind of come back this way and then end up in Vizcaíno Bay around January where the tag would pop off. And pretty much every single shark that we tagged during those years showed that exact same behavior. Every single one. October, November, as soon as our water temperatures dip below 60 degrees, we would see this migration. Now, the next one I'm going to show you, this was a kind of an experiment that we conducted. So this was a shark that was caught the same year off Ventura. This shark was brought up to Monterey and kept on exhibit in the Monterey Bay Aquarium for 5 months. That shark gained 100 pounds in 5 months. And the reason why they had to let it go was it was eating its tank mates. So they released it in Monterey Bay in February. Anybody want to take a guess on how cold the water is in Monterey Bay in February? It's about 10 degrees Celsius. So it's like 48, 50 degrees. But what you would see is this shark hightailing it. I mean, screaming down through Southern California, all the way, and it bypasses Vizcaíno Bay. It comes all the way down to Mazatlan, gets all the way to Mazatlan in April. That's how far it had to go to warm up for Monterey. And it literally made that entire migration in like 32 days. It gets all the way down here to Mazatlan, and then really interesting happened in April. The water starts warming up, and it pushes up into the Gulf of California. And that warm water, about 80, 82 degree waters, pushed that shark all the way up to almost the Bay of LA. And then right before that water temperature got about 82 degrees, we noticed that shark hanging out at about 150 feet. The surface waters actually got too warm for that shark, and then the tag popped off. So these tracks gave us really interesting insight on how environmental conditions influence the migration of these little sharks. The other thing that we were recognizing is typically along our beaches, when you see one baby white shark, you see more than one white shark. So here's an aerial photograph of Santa Monica Bay. Literally, Pacific Coast Highway is just off here. Will Rogers Beach is right here. Here are 2 stand-up paddle boarders. How many white sharks do you see? That's just kelp. But in an area the size of a few football fields, it would not be uncommon for us to see as many as 14 juvenile white sharks, young of the year white sharks, in an area literally less than 100 yards off the beach. So this phenomenon has occurred over and over and over again every summer, and we don't really know why they're in these groups. We don't know if they want to be together. When they're together, they're not right next to each other. They're kind of spread out like that, but there may be a social component to this. So to answer some of these questions about how much time they spend along the beaches and ask some of those social questions, this is where we use the acoustic telemetry technology. So we have these acoustic receivers located all along the coastline. I have about 120 of these from basically Avila, all throughout Santa Barbara, all around the Channel Islands, all throughout Santa Monica Bay, Long Beach, San Clemente, all the way down to the US-Mexican border. And then my colleague, my Mexican colleague who works at Cesese, also has a group of receivers down here in Vizcaino Bay. All right, so hopefully this animation will work. This next animation I'm going to show you is a bunch of detections that we got from 18 sharks that we had tagged in the summer of 2015. Let's see if this will run. So the flashes that you see are detections. Here's a date and time counter. So what you're going to notice is that here are our hotspots: Ventura, Santa Monica Bay, Surfside, San Onofre. These sharks are being detected all summer long. You'll notice that they skip, so we have sharks moving from one location to another. And if you keep up here, you keep watching this date counter, what you're going to see is October come, November's going to come. Normally, those sharks would be leaving. But in 2015, we had a very unusual year. We had a strong El Nino. Our water temperatures never dipped below 65 degrees. And as a result, none of the sharks that we had tagged that summer left. None of them left. They stayed. So basically, when the water temperatures were warm enough, the animals changed their behavior. They did not migrate. The next spring, a new batch of babies start showing up. And then my phone starts ringing off the hook. The public's going, what's going on? There's sharks everywhere. The shark population's exploding. And I'm like, well, the shark population didn't explode. The sharks changed their behavior. So there's simply more sharks around because some never left. So when we look at these patterns of detections that we've gotten from all the sharks that we've tagged with acoustic receivers since 2012, remember that fisheries pattern I was talking about, where fishers were catching sharks, but we didn't know whether that was where fishers were fishing the most? Well, it turns out that actually these sharks like these areas. So Santa Monica Bay, Belmont Shore, Huntington Beach, the bigger the bubble, the more sharks being detected, Dana Point, all the way down to San Diego. So we're seeing these hotspot locations. The other thing that we found really interesting, in addition to these hotspots, which we know are hotspots dating back decades from fishing records, right? The other thing that we noticed, which was really interesting, is that within a hotspot area, Santa Monica Bay, the whole bay is a hotspot area. But within that area, there appear to be hotspot beaches, and the beaches change from one year to the next. So for example, up off Will Rogers Beach was the hotspot in 2009 to 2011. We detected or saw no sharks down here in the south part of the bay. However, in 2012, we only detected sharks here and not here. So in different years, we're seeing them using different beaches within an entire hotspot area. And we have no idea why they're making those shifts and why it would change from one year to the next. So the other thing that we've noticed, remember some of those sharks that I told you that we could surgically implant transmitters in? Some of those transmitters that we're putting in those sharks last 10 years. So we can track a shark from basically from infancy almost to adulthood. So hopefully these animations will work. Here we go. Here's our date counter. You're going to see a little shark, and you're going to see a flash. Those are detections. This shark was tagged in 2012. Here we are in 2013. A year later, it's 1 year old. Detected off, it comes all the way down here to Vizcaino Bay the next winter. It spends all winter in Scammons Lagoon. And that's where the gray whales go to give birth to their calves. That shark overwintered there. Anytime you don't see a flash, then it comes back up to Santa Barbara, Carpinteria. We get a lot of detections. Notice it's now 2 years old, back to Vizcaino Bay the next winter. Detected in Vizcaino Bay in the winter. When we don't see a flash, we don't know where it is. Then the next time we detect it in 2015, strong El Nino, it's up off Morro Bay. So it's rounded Point Conception. So now we get a few more detections up there. Here we are in 2016. The shark is now 4 years old. And then the next time we detect it is back off Vizcaino Bay. So this other shark, same tag, same year. We get a bunch of detections in Southern California. In the fall, the next time we detect it is almost a year later. The shark's going to pop up in in Viscayano Bay. Gets to Viscayano Bay. Now it is over a year old. We get detections, again, in Viscayano Bay in the winter. And then you're going to see that shark leave eventually, come back up, and go to San Miguel Island. Now, what's really cool about this is typically where we see the adult white sharks around the offshore islands. San Miguel are where the big boys and girls hang out. This shark's about 3 years old. We estimate that shark probably to be about 8 feet long by that age. So it's hanging out in an area where it could potentially be eaten by adults. Last fall, we detected that shark at Guadalupe Island. So by the time they're 3 years old, we start to see them leaving the coast and starting to use the offshore islands more. And by the time they're 3 or 4 years old, they're getting around 8, 9 feet long. So one of the things we're able to do with some of the data that we've collected is try to make predictions on what would be the favorite habitat that these little baby white sharks like. So I had one of my grad students use some of the satellite tag data to try to develop a mathematical model, spatial model, to make predictions on where we should expect to find these sharks. So one of the things we found was, obviously, based on the temperature data, that they have a sweet spot, somewhere between about 60 degrees and 82 degrees, and they like to be somewhere in the middle. So if it gets below 60 degrees, you're not going to find them there. If it gets above 82, they're not going to find them there. In addition, we know that they like to be a certain distance from shore. We never see them going very far offshore when they're babies. And then, of course, we notice that they're quite often over relatively shallow water. Usually water is less than 400 feet deep, which in Southern California, you don't have to go very far to find water 400 feet deep. So what he did was he used a little math, just a little simple math, to basically derive a model where we can make probability estimates of where that shark would be. So hopefully this animation will work. So what you're going to see is this is a date counter. He ran this model for 20 years. Where it's red indicates where you should expect to find them, their favorite habitat. And where it's blue, you shouldn't expect to find them. So what you notice is in the summer and the fall, Southern California down to Viscayano Bay is the preferred habitat. But this area right here gets too warm. And then in the winter, this is no longer preferred habitat. This part of Baja becomes preferred habitat. So he ran this model, which was really interesting. And when we ran it through the El Nino period, it predicted that sharks actually should go all the way up to Monterey, which they did, which was the first time we've seen that, babies moving all the way up to Monterey in the fall. And my colleagues that have been working down in Viscayano Bay saw very few sharks that year because the waters actually exceeded 82 degrees all throughout here. So using this model, we were able to accurately predict where you should expect to find nursery habitat for these young of the year white sharks. So at the same time we've been doing this work, I have a really good colleague, Dr. Oscar Sosa, and he and his students at CICESE, Mexican University, have been studying white sharks and the shark fisheries that occur throughout this part of Baja. And this area of Viscayano Bay is an amazing area. It's one of the most productive areas in the entire Pacific. One of the things they found by working with commercial fishermen was it wouldn't be uncommon to tour the fish camps and find white shark carcasses. So they started asking the fishermen, well, do you know what that is? And they go, oh, it's a shark. And they'd be like, no, you know what that is? And they go, yeah, it's a white shark. And remember, it's illegal to kill white sharks in Mexico, but it's dead in the net, they're gonna land it. So they began to ask them, well, do you keep records of how many white sharks you've caught? And they said, well, no, we don't keep records. But if you wanna know, go in the desert. And they were like, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out Mexican fishermen believe that if you clean your sharks where you catch them, that they'll exude chemicals that will scare other sharks away. So they bring their sharks all the way back to the beach, they clean them at the beach, and then they truck the carcasses into the desert and dump them in the desert. And it turns out they use different dump sites every summer. So his students went through these dump sites, and it turns out that the climate is so arid and dry that these things mummify, they don't decompose. So they're able to dig through these mummified carcasses and identify and count how many white sharks were caught in each year. So by doing that, they were able to come back to the fishermen and start talking to the fishermen about, you shouldn't catch and kill those white sharks. When do you catch them? What season? These are all the locations where they detected white sharks being caught, all throughout Scammons Lagoon. And one of the other interesting things was they were getting baby white sharks in May, which is the same time we see the smallest white sharks in Southern California. So what this indicates to us is that there may actually be 2 nurseries in Southern California. There's one in Southern California and one in Baja, this area of Viscayano Bay. So Based on that information, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. And this summer really brought this out because we had a lot of shark activity along many of our beaches. And one of the things we're still trying to figure out is what makes a hotspot beach a hotspot. So to help answer those questions, we need more detailed information about what the sharks are doing and the environment around the shark. So to do this, I've been working with a roboticist and computer scientist at Harvey Mudd College to make autonomous underwater shark tracking robots. So we got a grant from the National Science Foundation. And what we do is we take an off-the-shelf autonomous underwater vehicle that oceanographers use to measure water temperature and depth and things like that. And we trick it out. We put 2 hydrophones on it. And then we can tag a shark, and what the robot's doing is measuring the time of arrival from the transmitter to the 2 hydrophones. And by doing that, we can actually tell a bearing and a distance of how far away the shark is. So the robot knows exactly where the shark is in 3D space and time. We program the robot to never get within a certain distance of the shark. We could say never get within 100 yards of the tagged shark. So while the shark is being tracked, the robot's moving alongside or moving in a circle and knows exactly where the shark is. We know the sharks can hear the robots because they have a propeller and they make sound. And sometimes the sharks are curious and they'll start swimming towards the robot. When they do that, the robot is programmed to move away. And even when it's moving away, it still knows exactly where the shark is. Eventually the shark gets bored, starts going about its business. The robot turns and starts following it again. So the idea there is we know exactly where the shark is in 3D space and time. But the great thing about these robots is they can do something my students and I can't do. They can swim and chew gum at the same time. So we program the robots to move up and down through the water column while they're tracking, measuring light, temperature, depth, chlorophyll, all those oceanographic parameters. They have video cameras on them. So they're actually seeing what's happening around the shark. And we can basically recreate the 3D world around the shark using this. So we can begin to understand what makes a hotspot beach a hotspot. In addition, the other technology that we're coupled with this are basically what we call smart tags. So smart tags, think of it like a Fitbit for sharks. It's a little backpack that we clamp on their dorsal fin. And this has a 3D accelerometer, so it measures acceleration in 3 dimensions. It's got a 3D gyroscope, so we get a compass. It's got a magnetometer. It's got a depth sensor and a temperature sensor. And it's recording those things 25 times a second. It's got an acoustic transmitter on it, so we can follow it from a boat or from a robot. And it's got a video logger, so we can actually see what the shark is saying. So this thing clamps onto the shark's dorsal fin, and then we can program this thing to pop off 24 hours later. It pops off. We can pick it up and download all the data. So here's a little video. Hopefully this will run. So here we are at Belmont Shore catching a baby white shark. Here's that little baby white shark getting released. They're all junior lifeguards right there getting ready to go in the water. And there's that little baby swimming off. So this summer, we caught and tagged 3 white sharks at Belmont Shore. We tracked 2 of them for 24 hours. And they spent almost their entire time in Long Beach Harbor. So during the day, they would move back and forth along that Belmont Shore stretch of beach. But at night, they would move around the offshore islands. They'd move all throughout Long Beach Harbor. And by the next morning, they'd be back at the beach. The 3rd shark we tracked was really interesting. So it did that for a couple hours. And by 1 o'clock, my students called me up and they said, we're going to need a bigger boat. And I said, OK, what's that about? And they said, well, we're 3 miles heading offshore. So we got another boat, got them going again. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, they called me up and they said, we're off Balboa Pier. And we need a bigger boat. So we got them another boat. And then by noon the next day, they were at Dana Point. And the tag popped off at Dana Point. Now that shark that we tagged in Belmont Shore is still at Dana Point as of today. So that shark is still hanging out there, moving back and forth. So it moved from Belmont Shore, which was a hotspot earlier in the summer, down to Dana Point, another hotspot location. And then all the information we got from that shark was indicating that at night, it would dive down deeper in the harbor using cooler water, but during the day, it preferred that nice, warm water right along the beach. The other technology we're using are drones. Drones are a wonderful technology. Because we're dealing with animals in close to shore, it becomes a very powerful tool. So we're using drones to survey for sharks, count sharks, but we're also helping the lifeguards use this technology. So this becomes a really useful tool for lifeguards because lifeguards have protocols. So if a person sees a shark and says, I reported seeing a shark, lifeguards have to send somebody out to confirm that. But why send a person out on a jet ski or something like that when you can just fly a drone? But they need information. So for example, if a shark's over 8 feet, they may opt to close a beach or at least post signs. But how do you know if it's a 6-foot shark or an 8-foot shark? So we're working with programmers right now to develop onboard software for their drones that will not only identify the shark based on its outline or how it swims, but it'll also estimate the size of the shark. So they'll have that information in real time. In addition, what we can do, so here's some aerial footage shot by Joe Bailey at Seal Beach. This is when they were over at Sunset Beach, and you can see how worried they are about jet skis. They actually just don't care. But we can use this technology to not only count them, so here's a technology that we've used to count leopard sharks. We're going to use the same thing for white sharks to try to figure out when they're in those groups, do they want to be together, or are they there for the water? Are they there for the temperature? Are they there for the food? So the other tool, you can't catch and tag every shark. So the other tool that we're using are called RUVs, Remote Underwater Video Systems, or what my students like to refer to, GoPros on a stick. So what we do is we have this PVC pipe with this weight, and we have this T-bar, and we put a GoPro, and my students swim it outside the wave break, and they stick it in the sand, and they point one camera towards the beach and the other one offshore. We turn the cameras on, we let them run. And the sharks are actually curious of the cameras, and they'll actually swim over and take a selfie. So with this selfie, white sharks have unique facial features just like humans. So we're working to develop basically facial recognition software to identify these sharks based on these unique patterns along their face, their tail, and on their fins, to build libraries of these sharks, which we can then track for years after year after year. So one of the other things that people keep saying is that, are there really more sharks, or is it that we're able to see them better? So this summer, in the past few summers, we've worked very closely with the lifeguard sheriff's departments, the police departments, which have helicopters, and they fly surveillance for the lifeguards. So we started talking to some of the pilots, and many of whom have been flying in Southern California for 40 years. And I asked them, have you ever seen this many sharks before? And they said, never in my life have I seen this many sharks, except for the last 8 years. So we set up a database for them. We asked them to start writing down where they saw sharks this summer. And we're only using pilots. We did a little bit of training. We wanted them to tell us how many sharks they saw, estimate the size, location, time of day. So here are all the locations of sightings that we got from pilots, only about 5 pilots this summer. And then this includes Orange County, Long Beach, LA County, and Huntington Beach. And then basically they can also upload pictures and videos so we can confirm their IDs. But for example, we can get information on size. Where are they seeing different size sharks? And one of the interesting patterns that we saw this summer was there are larger sharks up on Santa Barbara. In fact, we're seeing sharks in the 9 and 10 foot range off the beaches in Santa Barbara. And we think a lot of that's attributed to the fact that the Channel Islands is right here, a place where the adults like to hang out. We can look at it by month and see that we're actually seeing and detecting sharks as early as February off Bolsa Chica, which is kind of early. So now I want to shift things a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about what does this mean. So if white shark populations are coming back, what does this mean? Well, we know in California that we've had 100 years of overexploitation of marine animals, whether it be things that we like to eat or animals that we hunted, like marine mammals were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. We had dirty fisheries up until the mid-1990s, and when I say dirty fisheries, high bycatch impacts, killing lots of animals unintended that they were trying to fish for. And basically, we saw systematic loss of marine predators. Most of those ones are the ones we like to eat. But in a period of 50 years or so, we got rid of most of those animals. But it wasn't that we didn't recognize this. We've recognized these problems decades ago. So for example, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1973. We passed a ban on nearshore gillnets, mainly because we saw it was killing lots of sea lions and other marine life that weren't intended in that fishery. Magnuson-Stevens Act is the Federal Fisheries Management Act. It was originally passed in 1976, recertified in 1996, and one of the key recertifications was to decrease bycatch in commercial fisheries. In addition, California, being the environmentally conscious state that we are, passed the Marine Life Protection Act in 1999. We did all these things because we recognized a history of overexploitation of marine resources. So I'm going to use marine mammals as an example, and I'm going to use California sea lions. So all the seals pretty much show the same trajectory. So in 1920, marine mammal biologists estimated that there are as few as 2,000 California sea lions left in all of California and Baja. By 1920, they were hunted to the verge of extinction. If fishers saw them, they simply shot them. They viewed them as competitors. 1973, Marine Mammal Protection Act goes into place, and look what happens. If you quit shooting them, they actually start to come back. In the mid-1980s, we had a strong El Nino, and that did put a hurting on many marine mammal populations, but sea lions in particular. In the mid-1990s, gillnets get heavily regulated or banned in state waters. And look at this trajectory. So I want to point out that in the mid-1990s, the public is being told our coastal waters are completely overfished. They're so polluted, there's no fish left. Okay, California sea lion is one of the most voracious carnivores in our coastal ocean. They're growing at a rate of 6.5% per year at a time where we're telling the public our coastal waters are completely overfished. So how is that possible? And it's not just sea lions, it's northern elephant seals, it's harbor seals, it's dolphins, it's toothed whales, it's baleen whales. All these animals are coming back at a time when the public's being told things are bad. But remember, we legislated for things. We've been doing things. And by 2012, NOAA concluded that California sea lion population had reached its carrying capacity at somewhere between 220 and 470,000 animals. So in a period of less than 100 years, this population has probably completely recovered. So the bottom line is, what do adult white sharks like to eat? Marine mammals. So the adult food source, whether it be sea lions, northern elephant seals, harbor seals, dolphins, whales, they've all come back. So the adult food sources come back. So we protected white sharks. They're no longer being killed as much in fisheries, and their food sources come back. In addition, many of the things that were being targeted in the gillnet fishery, which probably had a lot of impacts on white sharks, have shown good signs of recovery. So white sea bass, which the gillnet fishery was targeting, are actually really showing good signs of recovery. And I want to point out that the remaining gillnet fishers that are still fishing outside 3 miles, for the first time, are actually making a halfway decent living selling fresh white sea bass to us. Now you can buy cheaper white sea bass, but it came from Mexico, where they were using methods that we would not allow our California fishermen to use. In addition, many of the other species that are incidentally caught in gillnets are also showing signs of recovery since the ban of nearshore gillnets in 1994. So giant sea bass were often caught in gillnets. They're showing signs of recovery. Soup fin sharks, leopard sharks, all of them are showing upward trajectory. All from one management practice, just banning gillnets in nearshore waters. So remember, all those animals that are showing signs of recovery can't come back if the water's completely polluted. And for those of you that have lived in California a long time know that we had some of the worst water quality that existed anywhere in the nation up into the 70s. We were discharging primary treated sewage 1 mile offshore. And all those nutrients greatly affect marine communities. Many of those animals were greatly affected. So in addition, we had a lot of industry in LA, and those industries were dumping contaminants in through that wastewater treatment system. And as a result, we have one of the largest Superfund sites in the world, off Palos Verdes, where over 100 tons of DDT, tons, were discharged offshore and remains resident in these sediments. But the bottom line is, in 1972, because of concerned citizens from California and many other places, went and fought for the Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972. And it required that nutrients could no longer be discharged offshore. That required innovation. Now, as a result, we have full secondary treatment of wastewater, in some cases tertiary treatment, in other words, toilet to tap. You can drink the water by the time they're done with it. For 22 million people, we have the best wastewater treatment that exists anywhere in the world in Southern California. We still have problems. We still have trash. We still have runoff and things like that. But by and large, we have 5 times more people living in California, and we have cleaner water now than we did 40 years ago. So the reason why marine mammals are coming back is because the water's gotten better. And of course, everything we put in the atmosphere ends up in the water. So the bottom line is California had some of the worst air quality as well up into the 40s. Basically, concerned citizens went and fought for the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970. And now we have 5 times more people in Southern California. We have 28 times more vehicles on the road, and we have cleaner air now than we did 40 years ago. So the bottom line is all these things that we hear about on a daily basis have been getting better. Those legislative things we put in place, the innovations that we did to help deal with those problems have been getting better. And as a result, our predators are coming back. So I would argue predators, things at the top of the food chain, are the most sensitive. So they can't have a system out of whack and come back. So the bottom line is it's taken decades. This is why people keep saying, where are all these sharks coming from? It's taken decades for us to actually see this. But now that it's happening, we can actually see the ecosystem fill in behind it. So I would argue that probably one of our greatest conservation success stories could be the recovery of white sharks. So the bottom line is we have to care about something to enact protection for it or regulations for it. And when we do that, we innovate. And when we innovate, we allow for increased growth. Okay, so the problem is, as these animals come back, we see new issues occurring. And conservation problems are never fully solved, right? So white sharks are protected, but as they've come back, people are actually accidentally catching them off piers, in some cases intentionally catching them. And it's illegal to do this. So the bottom line is, this year we heard of at least 4 intentional fishery mortalities. Fish and Game made some arrests, but no convictions. Unfortunately, the charges were dropped. In addition, we have fishermen now chumming off beaches. That's not a good idea. They're chumming to bring sharks in to catch, but these are beaches where people are swimming, kids are swimming. And by the way, it is not illegal to chum in California waters. According to Fish and Game, it is not illegal. But now some of the cities are making it illegal because it is not safe for people to do that. In addition, this year, for the first time, we actually saw the development of a new industry, shark watching. So there are boats, actually 7 boats, going out to take people out to see sharks, charging people to see white sharks. And by the way, that's a really cool thing, but keep in mind, there are no rules or guidelines for them on how to do this in ways that don't affect the sharks or put people at risk. So remember, it's a good thing that sharks may be coming back, but we're going to have to keep our eye on the ball. We're going to have to keep changing regulations to make sure that everybody stays safe. So this is, in my opinion, this requires better education. So we work very closely with the lifeguards who are they're on the front lines of dealing with the public and sharks, and we're working hard to get them good information. They're working hard to get good information to you. So when you go to the beach, you know what you should expect when you go to that beach, whether it be sharks and what you need to know about those sharks. In addition, we work closely with city councils because this summer, for example, there were economic impacts as a result of all the shark media. Remember? So it was in the news every single day, and it cost Huntington Beach somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple $1 million of lost revenue due to hotel cancellations just because of that. So even the city councils need to be educated on these issues. And then, of course, the general public. And this is where places like the Aquarium do a great job. So we need to get good science in the hands of educators. And of course, we're even using a lot of our science in K-12 curricula. So all our transmitters that we use, there will now be 8th grade physics education where students will learn about how transmitters work and how to track sharks using these technologies. So with that, I will gladly answer any questions. Thank you.